Sarah Martinez had always been particular about her garden. After 15 years working in classified operations across 3 continents, tending to her roses and tulips was the only thing that brought her genuine peace. The small suburban house in Arlington, Virginia was supposed to be her sanctuary, a place where nobody knew about the dangerous missions or the scars hidden beneath her casual clothing. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Sarah woke up at 5:30, made herself a strong cup of black coffee, and stepped into her backyard. The early morning dew sparkled on the petals of her prized yellow roses. She had spent 3 months nursing them back to health after a particularly harsh winter. Each bloom represented hours of careful attention, the right balance of water and sunlight, protection from pests, and endless patience. She smiled as she walked along the neat flower beds that bordered her property. The tulips were just beginning to open, their red and white petals creating a stunning display along the fence line. Her neighbors often commented on how beautiful her garden looked, and some even asked for advice on growing their own flowers. Sarah always kept her answers simple and friendly, never revealing that gardening was her way of maintaining sanity after years of living in constant danger. Around 9 in the morning, she heard the sound of heavy boots approaching her front yard. Sarah glanced through her window and saw a police officer walking up to her door. He was young, probably in his late 20s, with a stern expression that suggested he took his job very seriously. She opened the door before he could knock. Officer Derek Thompson stood on her porch, his hand resting on his belt. He looked at Sarah with barely concealed irritation. Without any greeting or introduction, he launched into his reason for the visit. According to him, her flower beds extended beyond her property line by approximately 6 inches. Someone in the neighborhood had filed a complaint, and he was there to enforce local ordinances. Sarah remained calm and polite. She explained that she had carefully measured her property boundaries when she first planted the flowers 2 years ago. She even offered to show him the survey documents from the county office. But Officer Thompson was not interested in hearing her explanation. He cut her off mid-sentence, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. The situation escalated quickly. Thompson informed her that he had the authority to remove any violations immediately. Sarah tried to reason with him, suggesting they could call the county office together to verify the exact property lines. She spoke in a measured tone, the same voice she used when negotiating with hostile contacts in foreign countries, but the officer seemed to take her calmness as disrespect. Thompson walked past her without permission, heading straight to the backyard. Sarah followed, her jaw clenched. Years of training had taught her to control her emotions, but watching someone march onto her property with such arrogance tested her patience. She had dealt with armed militants, corrupt officials, and dangerous criminals. Yet somehow this local cop was pushing her limits. When they reached the backyard, Thompson barely glanced at the flower beds. He pulled out a measuring tape and made a show of checking the distance from the fence to the flowers. His measurements were careless and rushed. Sarah pointed out that he was not measuring from the correct markers, but he ignored her completely. In his mind, he had already decided she was guilty of the violation. What happened next made Sarah's blood run cold. Without any further warning, Officer Thompson walked over to her prize roses and began ripping them out of the ground. He grabbed the stems with both hands, thorns cutting into his palms, and yanked them free from the soil. The beautiful yellow blooms fell to the ground, their petals scattering in the morning breeze. Sarah stood frozen, watching her months of work being destroyed in seconds. The officer moved to the tulips next, stomping on them with his heavy boots. The delicate flowers that had just begun to bloom were crushed under his weight. He kicked at the soil, uprooting entire sections of her carefully planned garden. His face showed a mixture of satisfaction and aggression, as if destroying her property gave him some kind of pleasure. Every fiber in Sarah's body wanted to react. She had taken down men twice Thompson's size in hand-to-hand combat. She knew pressure points that could drop him in 2 seconds. But she also knew that attacking a police officer would create problems she did not need. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began recording the destruction. Her hands were steady, her face expressionless, but inside she was calculating her next moves. Thompson noticed her filming and became even more aggressive. He shouted at her to put the phone away, claiming she was interfering with official police business. Sarah said nothing, just kept recording. The officer's face turned red with anger. He threatened to arrest her for obstruction, but Sarah knew the law better than he did. She was on her own property, documenting potential property damage. Everything she was doing was completely legal. After demolishing most of her flower beds, Thompson finally stopped. He stood there breathing heavily, his uniform covered in dirt and flower petals. He pointed at Sarah and warned her that if she replanted anything beyond the property line, he would be back to remove it again. Then he added that he could also cite her for various other violations if she gave him any trouble. Sarah watched him leave, her expression unchanged. She looked at the destruction around her. Months of work ruined in minutes. The yellow roses she had babied through the winter lay scattered across the lawn. The tulips were nothing but crushed stems and torn petals. Even some of her smaller plants near the fence had been damaged in Thompson's rampage. But Sarah Martinez was not an ordinary suburban homeowner. She did not cry or complain to her neighbors. Instead, she went inside, opened her laptop, and began making phone calls. Her first call was to the county surveyor's office to request an emergency property line verification. Her second call went to a lawyer who specialized in police misconduct cases. Her third call was much more interesting. She dialed a number that very few people in the world had access to. When someone answered, Sarah spoke clearly and calmly. She identified herself with a code name and requested a complete background check on Officer Derek Thompson. She also asked for copies of any complaints or incidents involving him. The person, on the other end, asked no questions, simply confirmed they would have the information within an hour. Sarah spent the rest of the morning cleaning up the mess in her backyard. She carefully collected the destroyed flowers, thinking about each one as she picked it up. These flowers had been more than just plants to her. They represented a normal life, something she had sacrificed for years while serving her country in the shadows. Now some rookie cop with an authority problem had taken that away from her. As she worked, her phone buzzed with incoming messages. The background check on Thompson was already starting to reveal interesting information. It seemed Officer Thompson had a history of complaints, mostly about excessive use of authority and aggressive behavior toward citizens. Several complaints had been filed, but none had resulted in any serious disciplinary action. The police department had swept most of them under the rug. Sarah read through the reports carefully. Thompson had been with the department for 3 years. He had started out well enough, but somewhere along the way, he had developed a reputation for being a bully. He particularly seemed to target people he perceived as weak or unable to fight back. Elderly residents, single mothers, immigrants, who did not speak English well, these were his preferred victims. He used his badge as a weapon, enjoying the power it gave him over others. By afternoon, Sarah had all the information she needed about Derek Thompson. The file her contacts sent over painted a clear picture of a man who had repeatedly abused his position. Beyond the official complaints, there were dozens of incidents that had never been formally reported. People were afraid to challenge him, worried that he would retaliate or make their lives more difficult. Sarah made detailed notes as she reviewed everything. Thompson had targeted a retired veteran over a parking dispute, threatened a single mother with arrest because her children were playing too loudly, and harassed a family of recent immigrants over minor code violations that other residents routinely ignored. Each incident showed the same pattern of bullying behavior and misuse of authority. The county surveyor arrived at her house around 2 in the afternoon. He was an older gentleman named Robert Chen, who had been doing property surveys for over 30 years. Sarah showed him where Officer Thompson had destroyed her flowers and explained the situation. Robert listened carefully, taking notes and nodding sympathetically. He had clearly dealt with similar situations before. Robert spent nearly an hour taking precise measurements using professional equipment. He consulted the official property records on his tablet, comparing them to the physical markers on the ground. When he finished, he showed Sarah his findings. According to his measurements, her flower beds had been entirely within her property boundaries. In fact, she had maintained a buffer of nearly 3 inches from the actual property line. Sarah asked Robert to prepare an official written report with his measurements and findings. He agreed immediately, explaining that he would file it with the county office by the end of the day. He also mentioned that if she decided to take legal action, his testimony and records would be available. Before leaving, Robert told her something that caught her attention. 2 other homeowners on her street had recently experienced similar problems with Officer Thompson. After Robert left, Sarah decided to speak with her neighbors. She walked down the street to the house of Margaret Williams, an elderly widow who lived 3 doors down. Margaret was tending to her small garden when Sarah approached. The older woman looked up with tired eyes and a weary smile. Without Sarah even mentioning Thompson, Margaret began sharing her own story. 2 months earlier, Officer Thompson had appeared at Margaret's door claiming her mailbox violated city regulations. He had been rude and aggressive, giving her just 24 hours to replace it or face a fine. Margaret had complied immediately, spending money she could barely afford on a new mailbox. Later, when she checked with the city office, they told her there had been no violation at all. Her original mailbox had been perfectly legal. Margaret had not filed a complaint because Thompson had frightened her. He had implied that if she caused any trouble, he would find other violations at her property. As a widow living alone on a fixed income, Margaret felt powerless against him. She had simply paid for the unnecessary mailbox and tried to avoid any further contact with the officer. Sarah thanked Margaret for sharing her experience and assured her that something would be done about Thompson. She visited 2 more neighbors that afternoon, hearing similar stories of harassment and intimidation. One family had been threatened with tickets for their kids riding bikes on the sidewalk. Another resident had been cited for having his trash cans visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though every house on the block did the same thing. With each conversation, Sarah's resolve strengthened. Thompson was not just a bad cop who had destroyed her flowers. He was a systematic bully who had been terrorizing an entire neighborhood. People were afraid to report him because they believed he was untouchable. Sarah knew from experience that people like Thompson only got worse when nobody challenged them. That evening, Sarah met with her lawyer, Amanda Foster, at a quiet coffee shop downtown. Amanda was one of the best civil rights attorneys in the city, known for taking on cases against police departments. Sarah showed her the video footage of Thompson destroying the flowers, along with the surveyor's report proving there had been no violation. Amanda watched the video twice, her expression growing more serious each time. Amanda explained that Sarah had multiple legal options. She could file a formal complaint with the police department's Internal Affairs Division. She could also pursue a civil lawsuit for property damage and violation of her rights. Given Thompson's history of complaints and the clear evidence of wrongdoing, Amanda believed they had a strong case. However, she warned Sarah that fighting the police department would not be easy or quick. Sarah listened to all the options, but she had already decided on a different approach. She thanked Amanda and asked her to prepare the necessary legal documents but to hold off on filing them for a few days. Amanda looked puzzled but agreed. She had learned over years of practicing law that some clients had their own ways of handling things. Sarah was clearly one of those clients. The next morning, Sarah drove to the police station where Thompson worked. She did not go inside. Instead, she parked across the street and observed the comings and goings of officers during shift change. She watched Thompson arrive in his personal vehicle, a large pickup truck with modifications that probably cost more than his annual salary. He walked into the station with his characteristic swagger, greeting other officers with loud jokes and backslapping. Sarah spent 3 days conducting surveillance on Thompson. She followed him during his patrols, noting which neighborhoods he visited and how he interacted with residents. She documented every questionable stop, every aggressive confrontation, every moment when he seemed to be looking for trouble rather than preventing it. Her training had taught her to be patient and thorough, and she applied those skills now. During those 3 days, she witnessed Thompson harass a teenage boy for skateboarding, berate a delivery driver for parking temporarily in a loading zone, and ticket an elderly man whose car registration had expired just 2 days earlier. In each case, Thompson could have handled the situation with a warning or a friendly reminder. Instead, he chose confrontation and punishment, clearly enjoying the fear and frustration he caused. Sarah also learned about Thompson's personal life. He was divorced, living alone in a small apartment on the edge of town. He spent most evenings at a bar frequented by other officers, where he drank too much and complained loudly about the public not respecting law enforcement. His social media accounts were filled with aggressive political posts and comments, mocking people who challenged police authority. On the fourth day, Sarah made an appointment with the police chief, Marcus Holland. Getting the appointment had not been difficult. She had simply called the department and requested a meeting to discuss concerns about officer conduct. The receptionist had been professional and accommodating, scheduling her for Friday afternoon. Chief Holland was in his late 50s, a career law enforcement officer who had worked his way up through the ranks. He had a reputation for being fair but firm, someone who expected high standards from his officers. When Sarah entered his office, he stood and shook her hand, gesturing for her to take a seat. His expression was polite but somewhat guarded. He probably assumed this was going to be another routine complaint. Sarah began by introducing herself using only her civilian name. She explained calmly and factually about what Thompson had done to her property. She showed him the video footage and the surveyor's report. Chief Holland watched the video with increasing discomfort, his jaw tightening as he saw one of his officers destroying private property without justification. Chief Holland set down his tablet after watching the video and looked at Sarah with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He apologized for Thompson's behavior and assured her that the matter would be investigated thoroughly. Sarah nodded politely but did not stop there. She pulled out a folder containing statements from other neighbors who had experienced similar treatment from the same officer. The chief's expression darkened as he read through the statements. Margaret Williams had provided a written account of the mailbox incident. Another neighbor had documented being threatened over a minor fence dispute. A third resident described how Thompson had intimidated his teenage daughter when she was walking home from school. Each statement was detailed and credible, painting a clear picture of systematic abuse of authority. Chief Holland leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He admitted that Thompson had been the subject of previous complaints, but claimed that none had provided sufficient evidence for serious disciplinary action. Sarah remained silent, allowing him to process the information. She could see that Holland was a decent man, caught between protecting his department and doing what was right. Then Sarah revealed something that changed the entire conversation. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her CIA credentials. The chief's eyes widened as he examined the identification card. Sarah explained that she had served in covert operations for over 15 years, before taking a desk position that allowed her to live a more normal life. She had moved to this quiet neighborhood specifically to escape the stress and danger of her previous work. Chief Holland sat up straighter, suddenly much more attentive. Sarah continued in the same calm tone, explaining that her background gave her certain perspectives on authority and its proper use. She had worked in countries where corrupt officials terrorized citizens with impunity. She had seen what happened when people with power faced no consequences for their actions. Officer Thompson's behavior reminded her of those corrupt officials, just on a smaller scale. Sarah made it clear that she was not threatening or trying to intimidate anyone. She simply wanted the chief to understand that she had the resources and knowledge to pursue this matter thoroughly if necessary. However, she preferred to give the department a chance to handle the situation internally first. Her voice remained professional throughout, but there was an underlying steel that Holland clearly recognized. The chief assured her that immediate action would be taken. He promised to launch a full internal investigation into Thompson's conduct. He also offered to personally review all previous complaints against the officer that had been dismissed or minimized. Sarah appreciated his response but added one more request. She wanted Thompson to be informed about who she was and what she did for a living. Chief Holland looked surprised at this request. Sarah explained her reasoning. Thompson needed to understand that his victims were not powerless. He had gotten away with bullying behavior because he chose targets who seemed unable to fight back. Learning that he had messed with someone who had the training and resources to challenge him might teach him an important lesson about making assumptions. The chief agreed to Sarah's request. He called Thompson into his office that same afternoon. Sarah was not present for that meeting, but she later learned the details from Holland. Thompson had walked into the office with his usual cocky attitude, clearly assuming this was about another minor complaint that would be swept aside. His attitude changed rapidly when the chief showed him the video and the surveyor's report. Thompson had tried to defend his actions, claiming he was just enforcing city ordinances. The chief cut him off and showed him the other neighbor statements. As Thompson read through them, his face grew pale. He started to realize that this was not going to disappear quietly. Then Chief Holland dropped the biggest revelation. He told Thompson exactly who Sarah Martinez was and what she did for a living. According to the chief, Thompson's reaction was memorable. The color drained from his face completely. His hands started shaking as he set down the papers. He stammered something about not knowing and making an honest mistake. Chief Holland shut that down immediately. He pointed out that Thompson's behavior had nothing to do with honest mistakes. It was a pattern of deliberate intimidation and abuse of authority. The chief placed Thompson on immediate administrative leave pending the investigation. He also informed the officer that he would be required to attend counseling sessions and additional training on proper conduct if he wanted to keep his job. Thompson left the office looking like he had been punched in the stomach. His swagger was completely gone, replaced by genuine fear about his career and possible legal consequences. Word spread quickly through the police department about what had happened. Officers who had worked with Thompson were not entirely surprised. Many had noticed his aggressive behavior but had not said anything, either because they did not want to cause trouble or because they assumed nothing would change. Now they saw that actions had consequences, even for police officers who thought they were untouchable. Over the following week, Sarah received several apologies. Chief Holland called her personally to update her on the investigation's progress. He had discovered that Thompson's previous complaints had indeed been inadequately investigated. The department had a culture of protecting officers from accountability, something Holland was now determined to change. He thanked Sarah for bringing these issues to light in a way that could not be ignored. Thompson himself showed up at Sarah's house one evening, looking nervous and defeated. He stood on her porch, the same place where he had arrogantly announced his intention to destroy her property just weeks earlier. This time his tone was completely different. He apologized for his actions and offered to pay for all the destroyed flowers and any other damages. His voice shook slightly as he spoke. Sarah listened to his apology without interrupting. When he finished, she told him that she would accept financial compensation for the destroyed flowers. However, she also made it clear that money was not the main issue. The problem was his abuse of authority and the fear he had spread through the neighborhood. She hoped he would use this experience to become a better officer, one who protected and served rather than intimidated and punished. Thompson nodded repeatedly, looking genuinely remorseful. He admitted that he had let the power of his badge go to his head. He had started to see residents as problems to be managed, rather than people to be helped. Learning that he had destroyed the property of a CIA agent had been a wake-up call. If he had misjudged her so badly, how many other people had he wronged while assuming they were powerless? Sarah asked Thompson if he had apologized to the other neighbors he had harassed. He admitted that he had not yet done so. Sarah made it clear that apologizing to her alone was not enough. If he truly wanted to make amends, he needed to face all the people he had wronged and take responsibility for his actions. Thompson agreed, promising to visit each person who had filed a statement and offer sincere apologies. Over the next few days, Thompson did exactly that. He visited Margaret Williams and apologized for the mailbox incident, reimbursing her for the unnecessary expense. He apologized to the family with children, admitting that he had been unreasonable about normal childhood activities. He spoke with each person he had targeted, acknowledging his mistakes and asking for their forgiveness. Not everyone accepted his apologies graciously, but at least he was trying to make things right. The neighborhood slowly began to relax. People no longer felt afraid when they saw a police car driving down their street. The atmosphere of intimidation that Thompson had created began to dissipate. Residents started to trust that they could live their lives without worrying about being harassed over minor issues. Some people even began to see Thompson differently, appreciating that he was at least attempting to change his behavior. The internal investigation at the police department took nearly 6 weeks to complete. Chief Holland had assembled a team to review Thompson's entire history with the department, interviewing fellow officers, supervisors, and citizens who had interactions with him. The findings were damning. Thompson had accumulated over 30 complaints during his 3 years on the force, far more than any other officer in the department. Most of these complaints had been dismissed or minimized by supervisors who did not want to deal with the paperwork and scrutiny that came with disciplinary actions. The investigation revealed a systemic problem within the department. Officers were rarely held accountable for misconduct, which encouraged bad behavior and discouraged citizens from filing complaints. Thompson was just one symptom of a much larger issue. Chief Holland took the findings seriously. He implemented new policies requiring all citizen complaints to be properly investigated and documented. He established an independent review board that included community members, not just police officials. He also mandated additional training for all officers on proper use of authority and interaction with the public. These changes would not fix everything overnight, but they were important steps toward accountability. As for Thompson, the investigation resulted in a formal reprimand being placed in his permanent record. He was required to complete 40 hours of additional training on community policing and conflict de-escalation. He was also placed on probation for 1 year, during which his conduct would be closely monitored. Any further complaints would likely result in termination. The chief made it clear that Thompson was being given one chance to prove he could change. Sarah watched these developments with cautious optimism. She knew from her intelligence work that institutional change was slow and difficult. People resisted accountability, especially when they had enjoyed operating without consequences for a long time. However, she also knew that change had to start somewhere. If her experience with Thompson led to even small improvements in how the department operated, then something good had come from the destruction of her flower garden. Meanwhile, Sarah began replanting her garden. Thompson had sent her a check covering the cost of replacing all the destroyed flowers, along with extra money for the time and effort required. She used the funds to buy even better quality plants and some new gardening equipment. On a warm Saturday morning, she was out in her backyard preparing the soil when she noticed Thompson's police car pulling up to her house. She set down her trowel and walked to the front yard, wondering what he wanted now. Thompson got out of his car, this time in full uniform but with none of his previous arrogance. He was carrying a large flat of flowers in various colors. He approached her hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable but determined to follow through with whatever he had planned. Thompson explained that he wanted to help her replant the garden. He admitted that simply sending money did not feel like enough to make amends for what he had done. He had gone to a local nursery and asked the staff to recommend the best quality flowers for the climate and season. He had purchased them with his own money, not wanting to just hand over a check and walk away from the damage he had caused. Sarah was surprised by the gesture, but could see that Thompson was being genuine. She accepted his offer to help, and together they spent the next few hours working in her garden. It was strange, almost surreal, working side by side with the man who had so aggressively destroyed these same flower beds weeks earlier. Thompson worked quietly, following her instructions and asking questions about proper planting techniques. As they worked, Thompson opened up about his struggles. He talked about how his divorce had made him angry and bitter. He had started taking that anger out on his job, using his authority to feel powerful when other parts of his life felt out of control. He knew his behavior had been wrong, but he had convinced himself that he was just being a tough cop who did not take any nonsense from anyone. Sarah listened without judgment, occasionally offering her own perspective. She told him about her work with the CIA, carefully avoiding classified details but sharing some of the lessons she had learned about power and its proper use. She explained that real strength came from protecting the vulnerable, not from dominating them. Authority should be used to help and serve, not to intimidate and punish. Thompson absorbed her words thoughtfully. He admitted that he had never thought about his job that way. The police academy had trained him in procedures and laws, but nobody had really taught him about the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. He had seen too many other officers treating citizens with disrespect or indifference, and he had adopted those same attitudes without questioning whether they were right. By the time they finished planting, the garden looked beautiful. The new flowers added splashes of color throughout the beds, creating an even more vibrant display than before. Thompson stood back and looked at their work with obvious satisfaction.
He commented that it felt good to create something instead of destroying it.
Sarah smiled at that observation. noting that it was an important lesson he should remember. Before Thompson left, Sarah told him something important. She said that she would be watching his progress, not to threaten him, but because she genuinely hoped he would become a better officer. She had seen too many people waste their potential by continuing down destructive paths. Thompson had been given a second chance, and she hoped he would make the most of it. He promised her that he would try his best to change. Over the following months, Sarah occasionally heard updates about Thompson through her neighbors and contacts at the police department. He was attending all his required training sessions and reportedly taking them seriously. His interactions with residents had become noticeably more professional and respectful. He was not perfect, and old habits sometimes showed through, but he was making genuine efforts to improve his conduct. One afternoon, Sarah saw Thompson responding to a call on her street. An elderly man had fallen in his driveway and needed assistance. She watched from her window as Thompson approached the situation with patience and compassion. He helped the man up carefully, checked him for injuries, and called for medical assistance. He stayed with the man until the ambulance arrived, talking to him calmly and making sure he was comfortable. After the ambulance left, Thompson noticed Sarah watching from her window. He gave her a small wave and a slight smile. It was not the cocky grin he had worn during their first encounter. This was a genuine expression of someone who was finding satisfaction in actually helping people. Sarah waved back, feeling hopeful that perhaps Thompson really was changing for the better. The incident also sparked conversations in the neighborhood. People began talking more openly about their experiences with local police. Some shared stories of respectful, helpful officers who took their jobs seriously. Others recounted negative encounters similar to what Thompson had done. These conversations led to more community members attending city council meetings and police department forums, demanding better accountability and training. Sarah found herself becoming something of an advocate for police reform in her community. She never publicly mentioned her CIA background, preferring to speak simply as a concerned citizen. However, her intelligence experience gave her unique insights into how institutions could change and improve. She worked with Chief Holland and community leaders to develop better policies for handling complaints and ensuring officer accountability. Her garden became a regular gathering place for neighborhood meetings. People would sit among the flowers, discussing ways to improve their community and build better relationships with local law enforcement. The destroyed flower beds that had started this entire situation had been transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. Sarah often reflected on how unexpected events could lead to positive changes if handled the right way. 6 months after the incident with her destroyed flowers, Sarah received an unexpected visit. Chief Holland appeared at her door one evening, dressed in civilian clothes rather than his uniform. He looked somewhat uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as Sarah invited him inside. Over coffee in her kitchen, he explained the reason for his visit. The chief wanted to ask Sarah if she would be willing to serve as a consultant for the police department. Her unique background and perspective could be invaluable in developing better training programs for officers. He was particularly interested in her insights on de-escalation, reading situations accurately, and understanding when authority should and should not be exercised. Sarah was surprised by the request but intrigued by the possibility. She thought about it carefully before responding. Working with the police department would require time and energy, but it could also make a real difference in how officers treated the community. Her intelligence training had taught her how to assess threats, manage conflicts, and work with people from diverse backgrounds. Those skills could translate well into law enforcement training if applied correctly. Sarah agreed to help on a limited basis. She would develop training modules and occasionally give presentations to officers, but she wanted to maintain her privacy and not become too publicly involved. Chief Holland readily accepted her conditions. They spent the next hour discussing various scenarios and approaches, with Sarah sharing stories from her intelligence work that illustrated important principles about power, authority, and human behavior. Her first training session was held 2 weeks later. 20 officers attended, including Derek Thompson. Sarah had specifically requested that Thompson be included in this initial group. She wanted to see how he handled being taught by the woman whose property he had destroyed. She also wanted to gauge whether his apparent transformation was genuine or just an act to save his job. The training room fell silent when Sarah walked in and introduced herself. Several officers exchanged glances, clearly aware of her identity and background. Thompson sat in the back row looking nervous but attentive. Sarah began her presentation with a simple question. She asked the officers to describe what they thought the purpose of a police officer was. The responses varied widely, revealing different perspectives and priorities. Some officers talked about enforcing laws and maintaining order. Others mentioned protecting citizens and serving the community. A few focused on catching criminals and preventing crime. Sarah listened to all the responses without judgment, then shared her own perspective. She explained that in her intelligence work, success often depended on understanding people rather than dominating them. The same principle applied to law enforcement. She talked about the difference between authority and authoritarianism. Authority was earned through consistent, fair behavior and genuine service to others. Authoritarianism was imposed through fear and intimidation. True authority made people feel safer and more willing to cooperate. Authoritarianism created resentment and resistance. Officers who relied on intimidation rather than respect were ultimately less effective at their jobs. Throughout the session, Sarah used real examples from her intelligence career. She described situations where showing restraint had achieved better results than using force. She talked about the importance of reading body language and understanding cultural differences. She emphasized that every interaction with a citizen was an opportunity to either build or destroy trust in law enforcement. Her presentation was engaging and practical, holding the attention of even skeptical officers. During the question period, Thompson raised his hand. Sarah called on him, curious about what he would ask. He stood up and asked how someone could change ingrained behaviors and attitudes that had developed over years. It was clearly a personal question, and the room grew quiet as everyone waited for Sarah's response. She appreciated his honesty in asking something so vulnerable in front of his peers. Sarah responded thoughtfully. She explained that changing behavior required consistent effort and honest self-reflection. It meant recognizing when old patterns emerged and consciously choosing different responses. It required seeking feedback from others and being willing to admit mistakes. Most importantly, it meant understanding why you wanted to change in the first place. Fear of consequences might start the process, but genuine transformation required deeper motivation. She looked directly at Thompson as she continued. Real change happened when someone recognized that their old behavior was not just wrong according to rules or policies, but fundamentally contrary to the person they wanted to be. It required developing empathy for the people you had harmed and committing to do better, not just because you had to, but because you genuinely wanted to serve others properly. Thompson nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Several other officers in the room seemed equally affected by Sarah's response. After the session ended, multiple officers approached her to continue the conversation. They asked detailed questions about handling specific situations, managing stress, and maintaining professionalism under difficult circumstances. Sarah stayed for over an hour after the official session ended, talking with officers who were genuinely interested in improving their skills. Thompson was the last to approach her. He thanked her for including him in the training and for answering his question honestly. He told her that the past 6 months had been the hardest of his life, but also the most valuable. Being forced to confront his behavior and its impact on others had been painful, but necessary. He was discovering that being a good police officer was about helping people, not proving how tough or powerful he was. Sarah appreciated his honesty and told him so. She also reminded him that transformation was ongoing, not a destination. There would be setbacks and challenges, moments when old habits tried to resurface. The key was to keep choosing growth and improvement day after day, interaction after interaction. Thompson promised to keep working at it, and Sarah believed he would try. Over the next year, Sarah conducted several more training sessions for the department. She also worked with Chief Holland to revise policies and procedures, incorporating principles she had learned during her intelligence career. The changes were gradual but meaningful. Citizen complaints decreased significantly. More importantly, positive feedback about officer interactions increased. The department was slowly building a better reputation in the community. Sarah's garden continued to flourish, becoming even more beautiful than before the destruction. She added new varieties of flowers each season, creating a stunning display that attracted birds and butterflies. Neighbors often stopped by to admire the garden and chat. The space had become a symbol of renewal and positive change, both for Sarah personally and for the community at large. One spring afternoon, Sarah was working in her garden when Thompson drove by on patrol. He stopped his car and walked over to the fence, admiring the blooming tulips and roses. He commented on how much better the garden looked compared to when they had replanted it together. Sarah agreed, noting that sometimes destruction could lead to something even better if handled with care and intention. Thompson shared some good news. He had just completed his probationary period successfully. Chief Holland had praised his progress and noted the positive feedback he was receiving from citizens. Thompson was also mentoring newer officers, teaching them the lessons he had learned about proper use of authority and community engagement. He had found purpose in helping others avoid the mistakes he had made. Sarah congratulated him genuinely. She could see that his transformation was real. The arrogant, aggressive officer who had destroyed her flowers no longer existed. In his place was someone who understood the responsibility and privilege of wearing a badge. Thompson had learned the hard way that authority without accountability led to abuse, and that real strength came from serving others rather than dominating them. As Thompson drove away to continue his patrol, Sarah returned to tending her flowers. She reflected on how much had changed since that angry morning when her garden was destroyed. A single incident had sparked reforms throughout the police department. A bully had been forced to confront his behavior and had chosen to change. A community had found its voice in demanding better treatment from law enforcement. Most importantly, Sarah had discovered that her years of intelligence work had equipped her with skills that could benefit her community in unexpected ways. She had always thought of her CIA career and her suburban life as completely separate. Now she understood that the lessons she had learned overseas about power, authority, and human behavior were just as relevant at home. The destroyed flowers had forced her out of the quiet, anonymous life she had planned. Instead of remaining invisible, she had used her experience and knowledge to create positive change. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best outcomes, if you had the courage to face them head-on and the wisdom to see opportunities where others saw only problems. Sarah smiled as she pruned a rosebush, grateful for the lessons that even destruction could teach.